And that's why Simple Plan, a band used to promote their awful role model clothing while subsequently promoting their awful garbage music, is not only one of the worst pop punk bands ever, but one of the worst things to come out of Canada.
Oh, hey Luke.
Dom?
The Dom?
Whatever! What are you doing under my desk? In your pajamas!
Well, I figured Florida would be the safest place to hide from the Hitchhikers movie.
That doesn't answer either of my questions. How long have you been down there?
Long enough. You, scratch your balls a lot when you review things, don't you?
Get out of my home!
No! I can't go back to that movie, it's too frustrating.
Look, the Dom. Take it from someone who's had to review 2 Limp Bizkit albums so far. The only way you're gonna put this behind you is if you suck it up and see it through to the end. It's the only way. If you don't, it's just gonna haunt you forever.
Huh. So, you're saying you believe in me?
No. I'm saying get out of my house!
Oh. So, I believe we were still in the change section, weren't we? So, yes, I wasn't best pleased with the last joke of the film where they physically turn the spaceship around 180 degrees before engaging the infinite improbability drive in order to travel to the restaurant at the end of the universe, as that shows a basic misunderstanding of the nature of the restaurant at the end of the universe and the infinite improbability drive. When your mode of transport involves passing through every conceivable point in the universe simultaneously, it doesn't make any fucking difference which direction you're pointing. You know what? Forget it. Moving on. Plot-wise, the film diverges into the realms of original writing when they use the infinite improbability drive to get to Magnaphia, but end up at Vitvodel 6 instead, and meet up with Hakuna Matata, or whatever the fuck his name was. Honestly, it never really gets back on track after that. I mean, the closest they came to it was the missile attack, and maybe Arthur and Slarty Bartfast meeting up. But then again, maybe not, because that character's original purpose was to reveal the backstory around the search for the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and they already covered that. As I may have mentioned, at length in part 1, I do acknowledge that this amount of divergence from the story is not out of the norm for a Hitchhiker's adaptation, but as I also said, it just lacks the Douglas Adams magic. The film chose to focus on the romance between Arthur and Trillian way more than any prior versions of the story. In fact, they changed a good deal of the story to revolve around it. It's worth noting that while there clearly was a lot of chemistry between them, they don't actually end up together on the radio show or in the books, because after Trillian decides to leave Zaphod, she chooses to concentrate on her career instead of being defined by a relationship. Yep, nice to know this romance is replacing a surprisingly progressive message, huh? For his part, Arthur ends up with a woman named Franchurch, who doesn't appear until the 4th books. Sort of. She may or may not have spontaneously ceased to exist, depending on which timeline you're looking at. To supplement this more romantically inclined sub-story, they add separate story arcs for both characters to go through, where Arthur has to learn to be more adventurous, and Trillian realizes that choosing the more exciting option in a lover may be less advantageous than being with someone who actually cares about her. Both of these things were factors in their personality in most other adaptations, but didn't affect the plot in any meaningful way. After Arthur Dent, the character I think they messed up the most was Zaphod Beeblebrox, and the changes to him are also the reason the plot ended up so different as well. What's really frustrating about my issues with Zaphod is that despite his more needlessly violent tendencies in the film, he's actually a damn good likeness to his book and radio counterparts. At first. He seems utterly full of himself, cheerful, easily amused, carefree to the extreme, kind of charming but also too much so, and kind of dumb but you're not sure if he's faking it or not. To me, it really seemed like he was shaping up to be a movie-redeeming, accurate book character. Right up until the point where they removed his second head and he spends the rest of the film all spaced out and disorientated and gets mega depressed in a very un-Zaphod-like way. What the hell, guys? You were doing so well. Why the fuck did you throw it all away? And while we're on the subject, whose bright fucking idea was it to add in a plot twist that the man famous for having 2 heads ends up with, dun dun dun, 1 head? Wow, a one-headed man? I've never seen one of those before.
And here, out of the mists of history, the legendary Esquilax, a horse with the head of a rabbit and the body of a rabbit.
Zaphod stopping Arthur from telling Trillian about the Earth being destroyed, presumably because he knew that she would be mad at him for signing off on it, would have represented a huge character shift for him. But as they made it clear that he had no idea that he had done that, as he thought he was just signing an autograph, it just represents another stupid plot hole that the film added in. It's worth noting that the loss of Earth really doesn't bother Trillian all that much in the book, as she'd already become vastly disconnected from it and everyone on there before she even knew she was going to get a chance to leave it. The original radio series and the TV show didn't even address her reaction to the news. Zaphod's second head being hidden on his neck instead of the two of them being side by side on his shoulders is admittedly quite an original idea, but it's definitely not how it was described in the book, as it's mentioned several times there that he had a left head and a right head, and if necessary they could look at each other for dramatic effect. This was another big disappointment for me because I was really looking forward to seeing what a higher budget and relatively more modern filmmaking technology could do with Zaphod, and this really did strike me as a cop-out, an excuse not to have to spend money and effort showing both his heads all the way through the film. Especially so after they removed the second head from the story completely. Zaphod's quest is ever so slightly different in the film as well, as there he's trying to pick up where the pan-dimensional super beings left off and find the ultimate question. He only wanted to go to Magrathea because he'd figured out that there were trans-dimensional gateways there that would lead him to deep thought. In the original story, Magrathea and the colossal wealth in technology, knowledge, and, well, wealth that was hidden there was the end goal for Zaphod. The fact that there was an ultimate answer to life, the universe, and everything, and an ultimate question to go with it was all new information that was sprung on them once they arrived there. The fact that this new plot makes it a massive coincidence that the Magratheans happen to be building the Earth 2 there for the white mice doesn't actually bother me though, as Adams did have quite the fetish for insanely unlikely coincidences. The new character of Hamakavula seems out of place in the Hitchhiker's universe. Yet again, there are claims that Douglas Adams himself created this character before he died. While this might be true, I would remind everyone that there is a big difference between coming up with a concept and implementing it in a film. However, regardless of how much of him was or wasn't created by Adams, he still seems out of keeping with everything else in Hitchhikers so far. You see, there was never really an evil character in the early books. That is to say, there certainly were people who did terrible and shocking things, like Gag Halfram arranging for the Earth to be destroyed to protect his paychecks. There's a group of people that felt destroying someone's brain with a total perspective vortex was an appropriate punishment for crimes, and an entire planet of people who wanted to destroy the universe using killer robots because they didn't like the idea of sharing it. But, believe it or not, none of these people were presented as villains. They were often quite nice, funny, and friendly in person. I mean, half the time the juxtaposition of their nature versus their actions was actually part of the joke. He even went out of his way to say that the Vogons weren't necessarily evil, just unpleasant and insanely bureaucratic. I always assumed that he never felt the need to include an intimidating Bond villain-like antagonist because he was far too good a writer to need one. So, some of you may remember that films writing out British characters, or worse, changing them to American for no apparent reason, is a bit of a sore subject for me. In fact, I'm just going to quickly update my counter on that. Admittedly, in the case of the Hitchhiker's film, it's a bit less of a clear-cut issue, because while I personally find it distasteful that half the cast have been de-Britished, I have to admit the character of Zaphod actually seems to work better as an American, and Trillian had already been converted in the TV show with no ill effects. It's also one of many things that the makers of this movie are keen to claim that Adams would have been fine with, as supposedly the only character he considered to be quintessentially British was Arthur Dent. I must respectfully disagree and claim that Ford Prefect also comes under that description, so he's the only one that I truly resent the Americanization of. Everything about him in the books and the radio show screams British, especially all his one-liners, which mainly drew their humour from snarky sarcasm and dry wit. Then there's the fact that he claimed to be from Guildford, a large town in the south of England, something that was commented on briefly in the film, then quickly ignored. These are not insurmountable disadvantages to making him American, but as far as I can see, there are no advantages to it. There has to be a reason for it, and the fact that Adams might not have minded isn't one. The only thing that springs to mind is they might have been trying to make it more plausible that he was related to Zaphod, but I really don't think that was a priority for them. As I said before, Bay wasn't particularly amazing in the role, possibly because he was a former hip-hop singer turned actor. What part of that CV screamed Ford Prefect so much they felt it justified the change of nationality? The lemon juice-powered thinking cap falls into exactly the same position as the original thought-discouraging Slappy Monster, i.e. no matter who came up with the idea originally, without a suitable explanation as to its function and backstory, it just seems like a rather stupid joke. The Vogons, while understandably popular for their practical effects and occasionally funny joke, are just another thing I don't think the writers got, you know? They nailed that they were very unpleasant, and they referenced them being super bureaucratic, but for most of the film they ended up being presented almost exclusively as imbecilic government foot soldiers packing lasers and flying warships. The idea was they were civil servants, they flew constructor ships, not battle destroyers. As I said at the start when I was grudgingly giving the movie props, the idea that we would be snuffed out as a matter of business is a lot more horrifying a concept than an invasion of killer warships. While there were some quite stupid Vogons, the ones that ended up in positions of power were shown to be fiendishly clever. I don't want to get too far away from the story we're talking about, but in later books their schemes for getting what they want become quite fantastically devious. Seeing them presented as universally stupid was quite disappointing, to be honest. It's also worth noting that in the book no Vogons lived on Vogsphere, as soon as they cracked interstellar travel they all emigrated within a few years because of how shit it was there. As I said before, Alan Rickman's involvement in this film is not, alas, enough to save it in my eyes. However, that's not to say I didn't like his performance. That said, I still consider Marvin a bit of a problematic character because I take serious issue with his look in the film, namely they designed him to appear very depressed. Now you might be thinking, but the Dom, he was depressed, that's the entire basis of his bloody character. And that's true, but he wasn't built to be, it was a side effect of them giving him so much intelligence and nothing to do with it. He was intended to be your plastic pal who's fun to be with.
Your plastic pal who's fun to be with.
The TV show understood this. They took a happy-looking robot and conveyed his depression with his tone of voice and words and what little body language they could show. Intentionally making him look sad shows yet another fundamental misunderstanding of the source material. Now, you may remember I mentioned the Vogons' reason for pursuing the Heart of Gold was different in the books and the radio show. You see, there they were being paid off by the galaxy's psychiatrists to make sure all the Earthlings were wiped out because they thought they were the key to galactic happiness and they wanted to avoid that. The film went a very different and, unsurprisingly, stupider route. You see, it transpires the Vice President was in love with Zaphod. I think they're sort of together at the end, and wanted him back as president, and the Vogons were just really confused because Zaphod happened to joke that he was kidnapping himself when he stole the ship, so they were trying to rescue him from him, which apparently involved trying to kill him. Now, the Hitchhiker's universe and the humour that accompanies it is heavily based in surrealism, but even with that in mind, that doesn't make sense. The idea that a president could commit crimes, maybe even treason, and the government would not only ignore this but want him to go on being president is just too stupid to even consider. So the joke where everyone turns into knitted versions of themselves is kind of funny, but also kind of stupid, as the book clearly says the Bridge of the Heart of Gold is improbability proof to stop this exact sort of thing from happening. I mentioned that Arthur's dressing gown was accurate to what could be considered the canon, but it really bothered me that the film showed everyone getting a change of clothing before they went down to the snowy part of Magrathea, except him, as, not surprisingly, this led to him almost freezing to death and made you question the whole thing. It's the kind of joke that only works if you never draw attention to it. I really did lose count of the amount of times that this film left me wondering how the hell they had so thoroughly misunderstood what made Hitchhikers funny. In the book, Ford convinces the foreman of the wrecking company who had come to knock down Arthur's house to take his place lying down in front of the bulldozer. The bizarre logic being that if they accepted the fact that Arthur was going to refuse to move and their whole day was going to be wasted standing around doing nothing, then Arthur didn't technically need to be there. Ford explained that if the foreman would be willing to fill in for Arthur while he went to the pub with him for a drink, then in exchange Arthur would switch and fill in for the wrecking crew later while they nipped off for a break. The absurdity of this line of thought was so unique you couldn't help but laugh at it. In the film, however, Ford distracts the wrecking crew by handing out free beer to keep them occupied while they were gone. This is much more logical and believable. It's not, however, very funny, because, well, why would it be? It also opens other plot holes. Ford needed to get some drinks into Arthur to cushion the blow of going through the matter transporter a few minutes later. If he had beer with him, then why did they even need to go to the pub? They could have just drank it and discussed the situation right there on the lawn. It's not like Ford had any reason to hide that the world was ending. There's other stuff too, like Ford attempting to shake hands with a car and Zaphod mistaking a caravan for a spaceship. The latter is just the very tired science fiction cliche of the spaceman that doesn't understand Earth stuff. The former, however, is a sadly mishandled attempt to recreate Adam's humour. You see, Ford selected the name Ford Prefect because he didn't bother researching the Earth very much before he went there, and thought that cars were listed as the dominant species on the planet instead of modes of transport. Sorry, for those of you who aren't familiar with cars, a Prefect was a model that Ford UK discontinued in the 1960s. The film, unfortunately, took this idea and extended it to Ford continuing to believe this once he was on Earth and could clearly see what cars were. Again, considering that the film makes it clear that half the races in the galaxy look exactly like humans, this only serves to make Ford look very, very, very stupid, which is one of the few things he wasn't in the books. Another facepalm-inducing joke adaptation is the Food Dispenser on the Heart of Gold. The original joke being that it performs an instant but highly detailed examination of the subject's taste buds, a spectroscopic analysis of the subject's metabolism, and then sends tiny experimental signals down the neural pathways to the taste centers of the subject's brain to see what is likely to be well received, then after all that, inevitably always gives you shitty tea anyway. It was a commentary on fad technology that's sold to you before it's ready and just makes life harder. In the film, it works exactly how you would expect it to and presents you with exactly what you're craving. It's presumably changed so it could be of use in the incredibly awkward conversation between Trillian and Arthur where she tries to explain why she chose to date Zaphod instead of him. Two things, film. First of all, fuck you. Just because this new Arthur you created as being a whiny little passive-aggressive bitch about a girl choosing not to be with him doesn't mean that she should have to give him justifications as to why she chose the option that would allow her to explore the wonders of the universe instead. Second of all, how did you not realize that by doing this you were killing the joke? The whole point of the Heart of Gold was that it looked great, but everything in it was just a little bit shit. Marvin was too sad, Eddie the shipboard computer was too enthusiastic, the doors got so much satisfaction from doing their job right they had to tell you about it all the time, and the food dispenser was too flashy to be actually useful. I swear these people must have gotten a PhD in Miss the Pointism. While the last joke of the movie remains my least favourite part of it, I have to say all the events leading up to it were pretty dire as well. It is straight up ridiculous how happy they made this ending. The evil brain-stealing mice are killed by a teapot, the Vogons are defeated by Marvin and carted away, Slarty Bartfast decides that as the Earth 2 is so close to completion they might as well finish it, Arthur decides he might try the life of an adventure after all, he and Trillian get together, Zaphod, I guess, goes back to being president and hooks up with his vice president, which seems like a bad idea to me, and the Magrathians bring everyone back to life who died on Earth. Even the fucking dolphins come back! Absolutely none of that happens in any other version of this story. Let's go through this bit by bit, shall we? This film is actually under the impression that you can kill eon-old pan-dimensional super beings with a teapot. For goodness sake, the white mice form was just how they chose to project themselves into our universe. If they were destroyed, they could just appear again in whatever form they felt like. Bashing them with a piece of dining equipment wouldn't have made one iota of difference to their intention to take Arthur's brain. I'd like to think that the film also knew that they weren't dead, but then I have to wonder, then why did the Magrathians think they could do whatever they wanted with the new Earth that the mice had paid for? On that subject, in no version of the story that Douglas Adams was involved in did the Earth 2 ever get completed, and even if it had been, the Magrathians weren't gods, they couldn't bring people back from the dead, that's insane! The idea was they were going to have to start the project all over again, build the Earth, put some Neanderthals on it, and wait 10 million years for the program to run. On top of that, bear in mind that these were the people responsible for the collapse of the galactic economy countless years ago. They sapped up all the wealth in the galaxy, then, rather than redistribute it, they decided to go into stasis and wait for everyone to become rich enough to afford them again. Does that sound like the kind of sentimental people who'd give away an entire planet for free? Also, so they were just allowed to keep the Heart of Gold. Was the galactic government working on a finders keepers law now? And unless I'm very much mistaken, I do believe I heard them say that they were actually going to give the point of view gun, a device that lets you instantly convert anyone to your way of thinking, to a mad cult leader. Do you have any idea what he could do with that? What the fuck is wrong with you? Plot holes aside, it really is the super happy nature of this ending that really bothers me. Adams may have decided, slightly too late, that the uber sad ending of the 5th book was a little too much, but that sure as fuck doesn't mean he was into wrapping everything up in a sparkly little package of joy and sunshine. So, to summarize, the book had no Hammer Kavula, no Trillian kidnapping, no escape pod piloting shenanigans, no visit to Vogue Sphere, no bug blatter beast of Troll, or at least not in this context, no trip to see Deep Thought, no Marvin death fakeout, and no stupid over-the-top happier than happy ending. I would like to reiterate that it is not that they added in more things that's the problem, it's the fact that they did it with all the subtlety and skill of a blind rhino wielding a rubber mallet. And on top of all of that, they then decided to cut out a bunch of things from the book as well. In regards to this section, bear in mind that even though the film does draw from the radio and TV shows in places, it's clearly primarily inspired by the book. So, as much as I would like to talk about the restaurant at the end of the universe, the B-Arc, and how Arthur and Ford ended up trapped on prehistoric Earth, these things were already cut out and moved to the sequel during the first adaptation process, so the film is arguably not accountable for their absence. Personally, I would have much preferred it if they decided to put these things back in the story rather than make up a bunch of new stuff for the middle, but I digress. Just concentrating on things that were in the book or in all versions of the story except the film, there's a whole bunch of additional Hitchhiker's Guide extracts that didn't make it in, including, but not limited to, the many and varied uses a hitchhiker can get out of a towel, which would have explained why Ford was always going on about them, and the long and complex history of Magrathea and the Galactic Empire, which I guess they covered in dialogue instead, but that's kind of a poor substitute. As the film had so much less time to work with than anything else so far, I guess this sort of thing was inevitable. Still, it would have been nice if they'd at least included Earth's entry, as even Ford's updated version is only 2 bloody words. What's more annoying is, even the entries they did keep were shortened, leaving out some of the best jokes of the book. They don't mention how most people consider the Babel fish as irrefutable proof that God does not exist, as it just seems so fantastically useful, it's virtually impossible that it could have evolved on its own, thus proving God does exist, which removes the need for faith, and without faith, God cannot exist, so he would disappear in a puff of logic. Or, after years of trying and failing by all the galaxy's scientists, an intern realized that he could invent the infinite improbability drive out of thin air, using a finite improbability drive and a cup of tea, then got killed by the rest of the scientific community who had realized that the one thing they just couldn't stand was a smartass. The book claimed that the rather nervous and dithery foreman that had come to knock down Arthur's house was descended from Genghis Khan, and occasionally had visions of horseback-mounted destruction of his enemies, which kind of upset him. A tad random, but that's Douglas Adams for you. If you only watched the film and were wondering why the Vogons would have picked up some hitchhikers only to immediately throw them out into space, that's because the film left out the Dentrassi, the race of aliens the Vogons brought along to cook the ship's meals. The Dentrassi really didn't like the Vogons though, so they liked to annoy them by doing things like letting hitchhikers on board, which was one of several things that Ford was planning to add to the updated edition of the Hitchhiker's Guide when he got the chance. Ford originally almost managed to talk the Vogon henchmen out of putting them out into space by suggesting he was destined for greater things like classical music, but unfortunately the Vogon decided to throw them out the airlock now and think about his career change later. Zaphod's Jujana 200 superchromatic peril-sensitive sunglasses may have made it into the film, but their special feature did not. They were specially designed to help someone develop a relaxed attitude to life because as soon as anything scary happened, they instantly became opaque, saving you from having to see it. Arthur and Ford went through a cascade of bizarre things when they were caught up in the infinite improbability drive field, including ending up on a seaside where the beachfront buildings rose up and down but the sea stayed perfectly still, Ford slowly turning into a penguin, Arthur's limbs detaching and floating off only to spontaneously return but extremely long, and an infinite amount of monkeys showing up to ask them to spell check a version of Hamlet they'd just written. I do have to confess though, the line, "Ford, I think I'm a sofa," is one of the few new jokes that really amused me. My personal biggest disappointment of this section was Slotty Bartfast's fjord obsession being left out, though that might just be because I really like the word fjord for some reason. Amusingly, he was given the task of designing Africa on Earth too, so was trying to think of an excuse to run a ton of glaciers across it to make more fjords. The Dom's final thoughts. If I had to summarize Douglas Adams' writing style in 2 words, with the possible exception of the book Mostly Harmless, which is a bit darker than most, I'd say cheerful nihilism pretty much covers it. Our universe is so fantastically massive and so mostly empty it can be mathematically proven that none of us even exist. Life is pointless and God was killed by a fish, but for goodness sake don't worry about it too much, let's just have a cup of tea or a pan-galactic gargle blaster and try to have a good time in the time that we have. None of this is carried over into the film. It's got romantic subplots that get neatly resolved at the end, everyone learns their lesson, and everyone who died gets brought back to life. There is a very good reason why, as soon as Adams died, the radio show stopped trying to be original and simply stuck to his books as closely as they could, even though this created massive plot holes and forced retcons as a result. This is because the people who worked on the radio show understood that Douglas Adams was a fucking irreplaceable genius, and any attempts by anyone else to improve on his work would only have the opposite effect. I really don't think that this was a malicious act. This wasn't the filmmakers believing that they were more talented than the author, or wanting to tell their own story at the original's expense. This is just a case of them not being talented enough to carry this particular torch, and the end result is such a juju flop of a disappointment. So yeah, the old jokes are delivered poorly, the new jokes flop, the message is gone, none of the new things that Adams wrote in made any sense because they didn't bother to explain them, and all of the characters are unrecognizable now because they're all idiots or cowards. If you like this film, fine, have at it, but don't try to claim that it's a good adaptation, and sure as fuck, don't try to tell me that Douglas Adams would have liked it, because I just don't believe it. The Dom out. Hello my beautiful watchers. First of all, special thanks to Luke at Rocked Reviews for his cameo. If you forgot to check him out after my ringing endorsement a few episodes ago, now's your chance again. Links in the description. Moving on to another of my favourite YouTube channels, I present to you Ask Lovecraft by Lehman Kessler. The concept of Lehman's show is quite uniquely bizarre. Howard Philip Lovecraft, the author whose gothic horror stories became so famous after his death they basically redefined the horror genre, has been brought back to life through supernatural means that even he's not 100% clear on, and has decided to use this second chance to answer viewer questions and give his take on the modern era and all the weird shit we've been getting up to as a species recently. A big selling point of this show is the host's ability to utilise the English language in the most fantastically unexpected ways. He's got a way with words is what I'm trying to say. And in case you're wondering, yes, he touches upon Lovecraft's famous racism, but handles the subject in a mature and responsible way. If you're a Lovecraft fan, or you just like clever comedy, the link is also in the video description.